Is Thomas keeping himself safe and his child safe and his wife safe? Or is he devastating to the father and conflating that there's a story going, you're devastating your father? This stuff is in the background. This stuff, it's over here. Doesn't matter so much. Here's a hard truth. Abusive parents often get a pass in our society. Then their adult children receive a job about that, which is to fix and forgive. The burden of forgiveness, reconciliation, and peacemaking is placed entirely on the child who was hurt, while the abuser is held to zero accountability. So let's talk about this. I want to introduce you to Thomas. Thomas is the oldest child in a highly abusive family. He recently went no contact and now only talks to one of his siblings who somewhat gets it. Thomas went no contact after his father made a very destructive scene at Thomas's wedding. Thomas's father couldn't tolerate that the bride's father went first in the speeches, and he threw a rage-fueled dramatic tantrum throughout the whole wedding. Thomas's father heckled the father-in-law, the bride's father, and accused him of showboating and stormed out. Thomas's mother followed her husband out of this event, half believing that he had a point. So the mother has this pattern of choosing the father over anyone else, no matter what. So hold on to that. The room was filled in reaction and shock and shame and embarrassment, which was actually Thomas's father's goal, to get attention when he wasn't given attention. Thomas's father, his rage at the wedding was just the latest act in a lifelong pattern for Thomas, which was a childhood defined by dramatic scenes, physical beatings, and Thomas having to make the impossible work of protecting his siblings since his mother wouldn't. Thomas and his new wife would now have their lifetime milestone of getting married forever seeped in the mortification and awkwardness that Thomas's father later argued was the right thing to do, since you can't let people push you around. And instead of congratulations, those who were at this wedding commented stuff like, thinking of you guys, can I check in with you, when the couple posted their wedding photos on Facebook. So now Thomas has a baby on the way. In a year into no contact, he made the mistake of sharing his wedding experience with a coworker that he likes. And that coworker said, well, all families have stuff. You might want to forgive your dad. Maybe that was just his way of showing love, but doesn't express it in the right way. This coworker said this casually to Thomas and kind of informatively, like, here's the 411 and all that. How might you feel if you were Thomas receiving that advice from the coworker? Thomas later got a phone call from his aunt, kind of like 6 months after the wedding. This is his father's sister, who told him, I know your father struggles and I know he's difficult, but at some point, you're going to have to let it go. You have a baby on the way now, and you can't deny him of a grandchild, you know. How might you feel if you were Thomas receiving that call from an aunt? And to continue, Thomas's own new in-laws, who were the father's target at that wedding, they advise that Thomas will have to deal in moving past his father's behavior and rage to keep good family relationships going. They don't push it, but they also don't say, I'm proud of you for protecting yourself and our daughter and your child. Why do they all require Thomas to do the work in the relationship when Thomas isn't the person that broke that relationship? Let's check in about this. Why do you think a coworker, an aunt, the in-laws, or even a stranger that you might experience online tell Thomas or yourself that you have to do the work at connecting with your abuser? What is their motivation to do so? Why do they all skip something very deep and impactful for Thomas? Why do they feel free to give advice to Thomas that the work is all on him? I would love to know if you have been there. Can you leave a comment right now about that why? Why do these people do this? And let's see if my thoughts on it and your thoughts on it line up. These three examples are all representative of people in our society who disregard what Thomas's father did and what that father has done to Thomas and his siblings their whole life, even Thomas's mother. So why is that behavior in history of the father what I think is unfairly skipped or just kind of bookmarked but never really gotten to? It's like later for all that, later for whatever your father did and blah, 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 blah. And it's kind of like, but seriously, Thomas, this is actually all on you, okay? It doesn't matter. what he did or what's going on. What would that work actually be? The work that Thomas is now having to do, the job that I referenced earlier. Apologizing despite not being the one who was abusive or caused a scene. Again, tiptoeing, placating, navigating an abusive parent, which doesn't work, but it's a lot of work, if that makes any sense. And also that father just continues to get to act out. And thirdly is the work is having to bridge relationships, bridging his father with his wife, his father with his son, his father with his own nuclear family and extended family, only for the father to bring toxicity there too, all while Thomas remaining invisible and what happened to him and his feelings do not matter. And here is a quick paradox for you to consider in all this. The people in society will advise and talk to Thomas, but not the father, right? Why? Why not take it to the father? And I know that that may sound silly, like yes, there's logistics, but the in-laws could. The aunt certainly could. We're going to come back to that paradox later and see if your thoughts are similar to my own that we can share on what might be going on why people give this kind of advice. But first, I want to take a second and introduce myself. My name is Patrick Tian. I'm an MSW. This channel specializes in childhood trauma as well as dysfunctional family systems. If that's of interest to you, feel free to subscribe. And I also want to draw your attention that right now we're coming to the close of our year and going into the holiday season. Many people in the U.S., because of a political issue, regardless of your politics, is that people are struggling to put food on their table. I've listed a nonprofit organization right up here. I would love it if you could donate to it. It would make my heart sing. It would probably make your heart sing as well. To contribute to this nonprofit organization that will take those resources and give it to food banks, because food banks right now are going to be slammed in the next 2 months. So I hope you consider it, and we'll back to the video. Here are the common feelings about the bind that Thomas is in about all of this. Let's explore these 3 issues briefly. The one is feeling shame and guilt. That to the outside world, it seems like Thomas is holding a grudge against his father. To the outside world, no contact kind of just looks bad. It looks petulant. It looks like very self-involved, like as if Thomas were just interested in holding a grudge and having it stop there. There's also guilt about the implication that he has hurt his father through that no contact grudge. Something that Thomas's father conditioned Thomas to believe his whole life. You hurt me. I can't believe you're like this right now. And that's very believable to a child. So I'm just trying to spell out the triggers around shame and guilt there. Number 2 is feeling invisible to the coworker, to the aunt, to the in-laws, who are not interested in 2 things. What it fully feels like to have your marriage and your wife's marriage ruined by your own father, in that hypothetical that I'm giving, and that he did that publicly. It's a huge piece there. What might it have been like as a little boy to live in that already hypervigilance about what your father is going to do or have a meltdown about next? Do you think that Thomas might have already been anxious about how his father might behave before any of that went down? A lot of us have to go through that. And number 3 is what people think of Thomas. This is its own video topic in and of itself, since going no contact is to be exposed in society's message that no contact is taboo, which is bullshit. It's been around for quite a while. Is it taboo or is it actually safety for people? But when we have these conversations about no contact with coworkers or with aunts or with extended family or our in-laws, it's human to worry about what people think about us when we've gone no contact. Here is what they actually think. This is the cruelest judgment in all of this. What they think is you're not being the bigger person, and therefore you are selfish and you are morally flawed. That is both their judgment and their advice solidified. What people think about you in going no contact or withdrawing is so brutal, but here is what we don't hear. We don't hear from people, you're brave, that you're protecting yourself from someone who is so off, and that you have actually nothing to work with your father. I too would be worried if I had a father like that around my own child, about his rage, about his moods. You've had to make an impossible choice, and I'm sorry about that. That is the 3 feelings about the bind. And what do you relate about Thomas in context of the society that he lives in? Here is the why they invalidate. Here are the 3 faces of that dissonance. Why does the aunt, the coworker, and the in-laws go there, even strangers online with you, and not hold Thomas's father accountable? They are choosing something. They are making a choice that is actually kind of about them in some way. All 3 examples, the coworker, the aunt, the in-laws, all believe that they are helping Thomas, but they are actually making a poor moral choice due to the dissonance that they are experiencing, conscious or not, which is a big factor here. They're kind of facing this dissonance of, should I be curious about the damage from Thomas's father? And then they're also feeling, well, if families are bad, that info would make me feel bad. See that kind of dissonance there? And now here is the why for that coworker, for that aunt and those in-laws about that dissonance. Later, I'm going to talk about the source of that why, which is kind of the hypocrisy of these three types of advice givers. Here is the coworker who lives in a framework of societal rules. Their core idea is that the coworker prioritizes an easy worldview aimed at Thomas over a complex truth, complete without any empathy or curiosity about what Thomas went through. That coworker kind of has a mantra: families are everything. Don't make me question the world. And the dissonance is, it's easier to give clean and tidy and empty advice, like, but she's your mom, than to absorb Thomas's trauma story. They fear that the implication that the world is going to be unsafe and there are bad parents out there and that some parents are truly abusive, they would have to feel things, or they might have even to question their own experience. And the insight here is that this is about them feeling good about their world and their helpful advice. They want really nothing to do with Thomas's real world since they're kind of cozy in theirs. And remember that brutal judgment from earlier about conflating Thomas's abuse story, the wedding info, that he is conflating that with him holding a grudge. Now let's move on to the aunt, who is kind of the face of don't feel that. Her core idea is that the aunt knows her brother's limitations. That's Thomas's father. But she kind of demands of Thomas to rise above those limitations like maybe the aunt has in some way. I'll get to that in a minute. That's complicated. Her major quote or her mantra might be, he can't help it. At some point, you're going to have to let it go. You know what he's like. The dissonance is, the aunt is an immediate family member who is likely enmeshed or maybe complicit or keeps herself safe from her brother. To protect herself and her own reality, she has to minimize Thomas's pain and hold him to an impossible standard. If Thomas's dad is a nightmare, and she knows this, but she overly accepts that he's a nightmare. The insight is she's probably protecting her own peace and her history with the abuser, the father, by shifting the shame and burden onto Thomas. Why doesn't she go talk to her brother about how he behaved at her nephew's wedding? Remember that brutal judgment I said earlier? With the aunt who can acknowledge her brother being a nightmare, but she still judges Thomas about conflating being protective of his new family with devastating his father about not allowing access to his child. Conflating, is Thomas keeping himself safe and his child safe and his wife safe? Or is he devastating to the father? And conflating that there's a story going, you're devastating your father. This stuff is in the background. This stuff, it's over here. Doesn't matter so much. How might you feel about that? Now let's move on to the in-laws, the face of, you just got to make it work. Their core idea is they prioritize family appearance and tradition over emotional safety. Their quote or mantra might be, you'll have to deal with it and keep up good family relationships going. We all have to. The dissonance there is, even though that they were the targets of the abuse, they are still prioritizing keeping the peace and maintaining a large, intact family unit. The in-laws are not emotionally pushing back against that societal taboo of going no contact because it's messy for them. And the insight is that their validation is passive. They understand the situation, but they won't risk upsetting the wider family structure by actively saying to Thomas, I'm proud of you for protecting yourself and your child. And remember that brutal judgment from earlier. Here, the in-laws, they're conflating martyrdom, meaning keeping the peace for a solution, when it's actually enabling abusive behavior in the name of good family relationships. Here are some final thoughts, and we're going to focus on the hypocrisy of this advice from these three entities. The coworker's advice, it isn't wisdom, it's actually avoidance. They demand a tidy world and a simple narrative because they may be compartmentalizing maybe their own emotional chaos, or they're simply psychologically shallow. They're not speaking from a place of healing. They're speaking from their own feel of the complexity that Thomas represents. I find in their own life of folks like this is that they can often have a very surface emotional existence, or that their life is actually greatly dysfunctional, but they compartmentalize it away. Their advice isn't the advice of an emotionally healthy person. It's kind of tone deaf is what it is. So what's the hypocrisy from the aunt? It actually isn't wisdom. It's encouraging, enabling, without having anything to do with the burden of the messy conflict with Thomas's father. Is she open to a real conversation to her brother about the wedding? Maybe she's had a million conversations with him that has gone south, probably. But she's telling Thomas to deal with his father, but she won't probably deal with her brother, if that makes sense to you. Would I expect the aunt to swoop in and take on her brother, knowing how abusive or difficult he is? Probably not, but context is everything. But given that, why would she expect Thomas to? Just for how things look about Thomas's father not seeing a grandchild. My brother needs to see his grandchild, but he's a total nightmare to deal with. Again, she's encouraging Thomas to make that work. And also remember that dysfunctional families don't take on the most abusive people in the system, but they often give advice as if they figured that abusive person out when they actually haven't. Now let's move on to the in-laws. What's the hypocrisy there? They tend to make it work with difficult people at their expense, and they might betray themselves in the name of egalitarianism. Maybe the mother of the bride has a brother like Thomas's father, who acts out, who blows up family events, but she thinks choosing connection is worth the fallout over the emotional personal fallout. So what do we do with all this? As childhood trauma survivors, we can be very mentally porous, meaning what people think about us in context of people like Thomas's father are going no contact, it impacts us too much. We take it in. That's the porous thing, but we actually don't have to. The coworker can be taken down many notches when we think about the most important part of this video. People who don't hold abusers accountable tend to be disconnected from their own emotions and the impact of maybe their own trauma story if they have one. So when you're in those feelings and people are giving this advice and we're taking that advice in too much and we feel guilt and shame, we're not feeling seen, and we feel the responsibility for fixing everything, here are some goals for me. I'm going to give you some advice about this stuff. Don't take in advice from people who aren't interested in the whole story or experienced what you went through. Another piece is don't take advice from people who wouldn't take on the abuser themselves. It's almost like, do they want your mother's number? Don't take in bad advice from people who might lessen themselves with difficult people in their life and call that diplomacy when they're kind of being taken through the ringer. I don't take in advice from people who are shut down from their own feelings, no matter how good they look on the outside, like the coworker or the aunt. A lot of folks who give advice seem like they have it together when they actually probably don't. So what all this comes down to is I'd love for you to think about this and leave a comment about this. What is at stake for you? Because the folks in society who give that advice are people who don't share the same stakes as you do. Comment right now about what those stakes might be for you. Comment about what you think those stakes are for Thomas. What are the stakes for the coworker, for the in-laws, for the aunts? It's sort of like consider the source. Here are some examples of what could be some stakes for Thomas. Is that they don't have to deal with the father's ongoing targeting him, or the ongoing abandonment from Thomas's mother, or that Thomas is caught between societal pressure and protecting his own children from their grandfather's emotional dysregulation. Those are some stakes. So lastly, here's a what if for perspective. How might Thomas feel if the coworker was empathic and shocked for Thomas, and maybe even went further and shared his own difficulty with his family? How might Thomas feel if the aunt called the father instead of him after the wedding and told her brother, you should be ashamed of yourself, and of course, Thomas isn't talking to you. You have issues, and I'm so ashamed of you. That's different than just feeling like they were morally superior to you and that they should be ashamed of you going no contact. How might Thomas feel if his in-laws were just a safe place to be in those horrible feelings and still seen as good without the pressure of having to fix? Here are some things to consider. Remember those comments from earlier. My main theory about the why people freely give this advice is that Thomas is more available and capable of change than the abuser. So people love to give the person who's more available, the person who's more reasonable. They love giving that advice to that person because in some ways they know it's not going to work with the abuser. Isn't that fucked? That's why they talk to you instead of shame the abuser. To them, you are more reasonable and capable because you're not an abuser. And you're also easier to call selfish and have that land and have you take it in about that mental porous kind of a thing. There's a lot to consider there. And that's my main theory, is that they don't go to the abuser because you're more available. So that's why the burden is on you to forgive, according to them. So I hope this video was helpful to you. I would love to know your thoughts. Feel free to leave a comment right now, and a message that you could say to Thomas's inner child who is struggling through all of this, struggling at the wedding, struggling in his childhood, struggling in going no contact. And it might be the same message that you would want to give to your inner child, or what they need to hear. Stuff like, your coworker isn't safe because he wasn't there and he's making it about him. Giving advice is easier than holding space for somebody. Or telling Thomas's inner child, you're safe in letting people think whatever about you. It's easy to judge instead of to hear what really happened at that wedding or in your childhood. Or, we don't have to take people seriously who don't know us and don't know themselves. You can flip it from that shame and guilt, from taking in that advice and taking in that brutal judgment, in about what they think about you. Instead of taking on their judgment, flip the script to reclaim your power in all this. If you were in a situation similar to Thomas, this power allows you to say that you're not going to do all the work in fixing a relationship you didn't break with someone that you have nothing to work with. You can choose to, 1, not take in the judgment, and 2, not do the fixing. While it may be flippant, I wouldn't judge Thomas if he said to the coworker, do you want my dad's phone number so you can tell him that family is everything? Or if he said to the aunt, have you called him about the incident yet, or helped him understand why a child goes no contact? You seem to get what happened because you were there, like why not do that? Or if he said to the in-laws, do you think that inviting my father back into my life is going to prevent him from his behavior? Do you think he'll learn about me going no contact? Or do you think he's going to feel like he won a game and that he's hurt when I allow him back into my life? I hope this video was helpful to you. We covered a lot. And as always, may you be filled with loving kindness. May you be well. May you be peaceful and at ease. And may you be joyous. And I will see you next time.